Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I wanted to give you a sense of in this talk is, well, basically to G you up and get you all enthusiastic about the next 3 days, and hopefully give you something different to think about. And I'm going to talk about a new area of research which I've been involved in over the last few years. My specialism, my background is nuclear physics, nuclear reaction theory, and that's where I've mostly spent my last 30 years of research. But I've recently got more involved in applying quantum mechanics in biology. And so I think what I'm going to talk about is a rather speculative area of research at the moment, which I anticipate may well lead to advances that will impact on lots of other disciplines, including medicine and health. So I want to touch upon a few aspects of where it may be of more immediate interest to you, but it's really looking maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Now, when we study science at school, it's very sort of compartmentalized into the three sort of different disciplines: physics, chemistry, biology. But if you go on to study it at university or go on to take it on as a career, as a profession, then there is overlap between these areas. So you'll get biophysics, biochemistry, chemical physics. Every combination of rearranging words has its own community, has its own research interests. One area here in this nice Venn diagram is the very center, which I'm calling quantum biology. So physicists and chemists have been using quantum mechanics for almost a century now, and we're familiar with it. So we've got used to the counterintuitive aspects of quantum mechanics, and we use it, and it's the most powerful theory in all of science. Biologists, by and large, have not required a deep understanding of the quantum world to make similarly impressive advances over the last century. So I'll say a little bit about why I, as a physicist, use quantum mechanics and can't imagine how we would understand the workings of the universe without it. Right from even before the birth of quantum mechanics, people like Ernest Rutherford first looked inside an atom, and we have this picture of the cartoon image that is in old school books of the atom. We now know, of course, that's wrong. Electrons orbiting around the nucleus is not like a miniature solar system. The quantum mechanics tells us these are fuzzy, spread out clouds of probability rather than individual particles going around orbits. But we are still struggling to understand and interpret what quantum mechanics really tells us about the world. But the fact is the mathematics works, and it's very, very powerful. I studied the atomic nucleus, and we now know the nucleus is made of protons and neutrons, and inside the protons and neutrons are the quarks. And in fact, the entire universe, we've almost gone back to the ancient Greeks, who believed there were only 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. There are only really, in a sense, 3 elementary particles that are building blocks of all matter in the universe. 2 types of quarks: the up quark, the down quark, and the electron. The Greek letter nu, subscript E, is the neutrino, which no one really cares about, apart from those scientists who work in neutrino physics, of course. But it's there to sort of make the sums, make the book work, add up nicely. And so throughout the 20th century, physicists have used quantum mechanics to delve into the building blocks of matter in the universe. And this is an iconic picture of one of the detectors at the Large Hadron Collider. This is the Atlas detector. It's essentially, well, it's bigger than any imaging technique that one would see in a hospital, of course. You can see the engineer standing there for scale. It's a vast camera, essentially, capturing the particles that are created in these high-energy collisions at the Large Hadron Collider. And it's through bigger and bigger machines like this that we've been able to delve smaller and smaller into the structure of matter. Now, in physics, we have what's called the standard model of particle physics, sort of a classification of all the elementary building blocks of the universe the most recently discovered, the Higgs boson, was confirmed just a few years ago at the Large Hadron Collider. We don't know if this is the complete picture. The standard model is still a work in progress, and there are still other experiments where we're sort of waiting for the next thing to be discovered at the Large Hadron Collider, in fact. I'm wondering why, surely was all that money spent just to find the Higgs? Well, hopefully not. But, I mean, this is, it's sort of obvious to think, well, okay, quantum mechanics has helped us understand these elementary particles. But if you look at another field, our sister field of chemistry, here is the periodic table of elements that you'd find on every school chemistry lab wall anywhere in the world. And I have very deliberately, I've got this little laser pointer, very deliberately given you the most up-to-date periodic table of the elements, including, look at these elements, 110, 11, 12, all the way up to Oganesson element 118. Okay, so hopefully new editions of school chemistry books will have this up-to-date periodic table. These, what are called the super heavy elements, transuranic elements, are being synthesized in particle accelerators. We can only understand the classification of the elements and the way they're arranged in the periodic table, first developed by Mendeleev, a Russian chemist in the 19th century, if we appeal to quantum mechanics. It's quantum mechanics, the rules of quantum mechanics, that tell us how electrons arrange themselves in orbits around atoms, and therefore giving them the chemical properties they have, enable us to classify them. So without quantum mechanics, we wouldn't even understand the periodic table of elements. But quantum mechanics is weird. This is my simplest way of describing the strangeness of the quantum world. This is the quantum skier. The tree looks intact. He looks like he could father children at some point. And yet, you track back the tracks of the skis. They seem to have gone around both sides of that tree in a way that if you saw this on YouTube, you'd think, okay, some sort of hoax. Okay, but that's what happens in the quantum world. Particles going in two directions at once, two separated particles instantaneously in communication with each other. These counterintuitive aspects seem to be a fixture. That is how the microscopic world behaves, and we just have to live with it. But it works. But physicists and chemists have had enough time to, if not completely wrap their heads around quantum mechanics, at least accept it. Biologists, by and large, really, if you get down to the molecular level, are still happy with their balls and sticks models of molecules. Okay, there's the iconic picture of Crick and Watson when they first discovered the double helix structure of DNA with a more elaborate version of this model. But of course, these days, molecular biologists will use computer simulations. This is a simulation of a protein, maybe 100,000 atoms, different colors of different atoms, different elements, all vibrating and jiggling about. But there's no quantum mechanics in here. This is purely sort of classical vibrations and dynamics, which is strange, because we know that once we get down to the molecular atomic level, that's when the quantum rules kick in. How have biologists got away with not using quantum mechanics? Well, actually, they've done very well. Molecular biology and genetics developed in the 1930s and onwards in parallel with the developments in quantum theory. And the two have been tremendously successful. What we're seeing now is potentially a merger of these two fields. If we look at the scale of objects in orders of magnitude, you start from something like a tennis ball, which moves and interacts according to Newtonian mechanics. Newton's laws of motion will be able to explain how the ball spins, its kinetic energy, momentum, and forces, and so on. But as you drop down in scale and get smaller and smaller and smaller, you eventually reach, you go through large cells down to smaller, to viruses, all the way down to biomolecules and the DNA, and obviously eventually reach the level of atoms, and then I'm looking inside the atom at the nucleus. But round at the nanometer scale, a billionth of a meter, that's where we transition from the world that is described by Newton's mechanics to the world that has to be described by quantum mechanics. And no one is really sure of, if there isn't a hard boundary. So what happens? How do these two areas merge? And why is it when we're down at the level of molecular biology within living cells, we don't have to apply some of the rules of quantum mechanics? What it looks like now is the emerging experimental evidence that there are phenomena and mechanisms inside living organisms, inside the cell, that require quantum mechanics to explain them. As I say, the molecular biology and genetics have been tremendously successful and continue. It's not like they're sort of stuttering and coming to a halt and require quantum mechanics to advance the subjects and help us understand things. Incredible advances in genetics in recent years, genetic engineering. Obviously, I'm sure many of you will have heard of CRISPR. I always have to spell out what the acronym stands for because I never remember. Clustered regularly into space, short palindromic repeats. It doesn't roll off the tongue. I present Life Scientific on Radio 4, and one of my guests recently was Jennifer Doudna, who is one of the people who are developing this new technique. It is quite remarkable what they're able to do. You send in this, this protein that goes in that snips away at the DNA and takes off a bit of a faulty gene and allows the DNA to repair itself with the correct gene. And the hope is that this will, of course, lead to presenting genetic disorders, particularly those that involve a single mutation in DNA. And other experimenters, Jennifer Doudna now, she is up for the Nobel. There is no doubt she will win the Nobel Prize soon. But she is concerned about the flip side of this sort of research. Germline editing, designer babies, the fact that you can go and meddle at the embryonic stage and mess with the DNA. Certainly researchers in China are now able to not just snip genes, but they can go down to the individual nucleotide, the base molecule in DNA, and replace it with another one. So the technique is no longer a blunt instrument. And certainly with advances like this, we as a society need to be very careful and consider all the ethical implications that it will lead to. I guess for you guys, I'd just like to remind people that something like MRI is, of course, based on a physical process, nuclear magnetic resonance. Nuclear physicists have still not got over the idea that you have to remove the word nuclear from MRI because it scares people. So you have to, magnetic resonance imaging somehow sounds more benign and cozy than nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. But even this, obviously at its heart, relies on quantum mechanics. Because after all, what is it doing? You're applying a magnetic field that's influencing the hydrogen atoms in water molecules, and a large fraction of the body is water. And the hydrogen atom, of course, is a proton with an electron orbiting around it. And that proton, the nucleus of the hydrogen atom, has quantum spin. Quantum spin is not like anything we can imagine classically. A proton or an electron actually has to do 2 revolutions before it comes back to where it started from. But that's not even the part of it. The popular science description of spin is that particles can be spinning in both directions simultaneously. What the hell does it mean for something to be spinning clockwise and anti-clockwise at the same time? Don't they sort of cancel each other out? But that's one of the aspects of the quantum world, and it relies directly on it. You look, all the protons in the hydrogen or the water in a body their spin is aligned in a magnetic field, and then an RF pulse puts them into a quantum superposition of their spin, and you watch how that relaxes, and that's what gives us the image. Even MRI is advancing. I'm sure you will be probably talking about it over the next 3 days. There's recent advances. I've just come from the Cheltenham Science Festival where I heard Professor Mark Emberton from UCL talking about this new trial of using 10-minute MRI scans to check for prostate cancer, to be able to distinguish potentially more accurately than blood tests, the difference between a benign or malignant tumor in the prostate. So even with tried and tested techniques like this, advances are being made all the time. Another imaging technique, probably my favorite, positron emission tomography, because it uses antimatter. And what's not to love about antimatter? You tend to forget about it. When you use these techniques in your everyday work, you forget that, in fact, what you're detecting are gamma rays. Where do they come from? Well, the radionuclide that is injected into the body, of course, and I'm probably teaching you to suck eggs here, so you know this very well. But when a radionuclide beta decays, it spits out a positron, the antimatter particle of an electron. When that positron hits an electron in the atoms of the surrounding tissue within the cell, the positron and electron, I like my animations. I spent an hour the other day putting all this together. They annihilate. E equals mc squared. So the mass of the positron and electron completely turn into pure energy, and photons, gamma ray photons, emerge back to back. And you can track them back to where that process, the annihilation, took place, and it allows you to get very accurate images. So again, it's down to physics and down to the rules of the quantum world that we use some of these techniques. Well, I foresee in the coming years new advances, new technologies developing based on scientific disciplines that I think will merge and come together. For example, nanotechnology. Down at that nanoscale where you have the boundary between the classical and the quantum worlds, we are developing machines, we're developing devices, we're developing materials, like graphene, single layers of carbon, which you can roll in one way to turn it into a conductor. You roll it a different way, it's an insulator. Another way in between, it's a semiconductor. So incredible properties of some of these microscopic materials. Nanotechnology, we know, is already going to transform our world. Genetic engineering, of course, is going to have a big say. Synthetic biology, building molecular machines, whether you're adding antibodies to viruses and sending them in to hunt down microorganisms. Quantum technologies, of course, is the other area where, so much of our modern technology is based on quantum mechanics, right? I wouldn't be giving a PowerPoint presentation using a laptop if it wasn't for quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics tells us how semiconductors work, and without that, we wouldn't have been able to develop the silicon chip, the microchip, the computer, and so on. So remove quantum mechanics, our understanding of the quantum world, and most of modern technology disappears as well. But there is a new generation of quantum technologies being developed. Quantum computing, quantum cryptography, quantum sensors, that I think are going to change our world in very dramatic ways over the coming years. What if those areas all somehow merge together to form some new, I've made it up, that discipline. Quantum bioengineering is only just starting to exist. But already people are thinking of developing living sensors down at the molecular scale that rely on the strangeness of the quantum world that would allow us, for example, in diagnostics to measure tiny, tiny variations in temperature far more accurately and precisely than any other probe that we might use in medicine. So, watch this space, because there are a lot of developments that are going to come online in the next few years. But quantum biology, what is it? So if we think about quantum physics as the foundation, the base description of reality, quantum physics, because the rules of quantum mechanics govern how atoms fit together, quantum physics underpins organic chemistry. Organic chemistry, scaled up in complexity, gives us molecular biology. There's no sort of magic, there's no transition, some vitalism that comes in that distinguishes between life and non-life. It's just a matter of complexity. And of course, molecular biology is life. So in a sense, it's not surprising, and you might think that I'm not telling you anything profound, that life must at some point, if you dig deep enough, hit the quantum world. Of course, quantum mechanics must play a role down at the atomic scale in living matter as it does in non-living matter. So what is the difference? No, quantum biology means something slightly different. If we think about, this is a cartoon from a book I recently wrote with a molecular geneticist, colleague of mine, John Joe McFadden. If you think about our classical Newtonian world at the very top, at the largest scale, and the vertical line moving down is also moving down smaller and smaller in scale. And once you get down to the level of molecules, say the biomolecules within a living cell, you would imagine that it's just thermodynamics and things bouncing around. It's mostly water molecules bumping into things, thousands of chemical reactions going on inside a cell. But the question is there some structure, some order that you go beyond the thermodynamic level and you hit the boundary of quantum mechanics? And the discretized, quantized order, the hard edges of the quantum world are playing a role. Well, physicists have asked this question for many years. In fact, going all the way back to Erwin Schrödinger, he of the cat in the box, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote a very influential book in the 1940s called What is Life?, which had a big influence on people like Francis Crick and Jim Watson and their discovery of DNA double helix. And he postulated that maybe quantum mechanics plays a non-trivial role in life in a way that it doesn't play in inanimate matter. Maybe that, it seems like quantum effects kick in inanimate matter when you cool it down to near absolute zero, Kelvin. Because that's when you slow down all the thermodynamic jiggling and vibrations of the atoms and molecules, and you allow quantum mechanics to play a role. It doesn't get washed out so quickly. And he said the structure and order, what we call low entropy, the order of a living system inside a living cell, is reminiscent of inanimate matter near absolute zero. So are there quantum effects kicking in inside living cells? And it was a hand-wavy book. It's a lovely book. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's fantastic. It's non-technical, it's not very big, but he postulates that this idea that quantum mechanics might play a role in life. And we're only now coming back and looking at it, giving it a second look and thinking maybe there was something more to what he had to say. A few years ago, the science writer Phil Ball wrote an article in Nature, and the article made the image, the front page of Nature, The Dawn of Quantum Biology. That's 2011. Since then, this field has emerged and become rather exciting. I'll show you why the bird is relevant in quantum biology. It's the poster child of this new field. Well, certainly at the University of Surrey, my colleague John Joe McFadden and I got involved. In fact, we've been thinking about some of these ideas for 20 years, over 20 years now. And a few years ago, we wrote this book, A Life on the Edge. We thought, since the field is getting exciting, let's write the definitive popular science comprehensive book of the field before somebody else does. Get in there quick. And as we work through the book, we go from the established, where we do believe there really are quantum effects taking place inside living systems, all the way to the more speculative. By the end, we're saying, okay, so this stuff is wacky. This is not likely to be correct. Quantum consciousness is my favorite wacky area. The idea that consciousness is mysterious and we don't understand it. Quantum mechanics is mysterious and we don't understand it. Therefore, the two must be connected in some way. And the Deepak Chopras of this world love it, because suddenly you can use quantum mechanics to validate any woo-woo type of science. Quantum mechanics, entangled particles at a distance can communicate instantaneously. Well, that explains telepathy. Or quantum mechanics explains homeopathy. No, it doesn't. That's nonsense. And, and so, you know, quantum mechanics and quantum biology is a serious field where we're trying to learn to walk before we can run. We're looking at very specific mechanisms and phenomena and trying very hard to try and design an experiment to test them. People like me who do the theoretical work, we just develop mathematical models, and it's great fun. Our job is much easier than the experimentalists. But this field is now becoming more established. It's still controversial. Physicists don't like it because biology is complicated. It's messy. Physics is easy in comparison. It's just common sense and logic, and solve one equation and it explains everything. Compared with, well, for me, the hardest area in all of science is immunology. Layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. Just when you think, well, that's because that, and that's because that, all the way, forget it. So I can understand why physicists don't want to delve into the messy world of biology. Biologists are not keen on quantum biology because they've never studied quantum mechanics, and they probably don't have the mathematical expertise to understand it. Although, of course, there are theoretical biologists who do computational modeling or who do systems biology, who are certainly very mathematically adept. They probably haven't studied quantum mechanics. Chemists, who sit in the middle between the physicists and biologists, they're of the view of, you know, what's all the fuss about? Of course, quantum mechanics plays a role if you dig down deep enough, but so what? It doesn't play a role in the mechanisms of life. Or does it? So that's the question. Well, there are a number of mechanisms and phenomena which are beginning to show evidence that quantum mechanics is involved. For example, in enzyme action, so enzymes are the catalyzers of the chemical reactions in living cells, and it was confirmed some decades ago by a number of research groups in Berkeley, in Chicago, and elsewhere, that the way enzymes catalyze reactions, they speed up the chemical reactions inside living cells by many orders of magnitude. And one of the tricks they use to help them carry out their job is to transport particles, electrons, protons, moving hydrogen bonds around very, very efficiently. And one of the ways they do that is through quantum mechanics, quantum tunneling, whereby a particle disappears over here and reappears over there. It sort of can be transmitted through an energy barrier that it doesn't have enough energy to get through. And yet, because in the quantum world, these are not solid billiard ball particles, they're sort of spread out waves, they can seep through these energy barriers and get across much more efficiently. So that is not something that is speculative. We now know, we are very confident that quantum tunneling plays a role in enzyme action. Whether people find that incredible, amazing, I don't know. I do, because I think that is a non-trivial quantum effect that is really, without which life wouldn't be able to function. Photosynthesis. Well, I've said well established here, but there are still papers being published that argue against it. The idea, photosynthesis in plants or in many types of bacteria, where the photon of light, of sunlight, is captured by a chlorophyll molecule, and then that is delivered all the way to the reaction center within the cell, where it's turned into chemical energy. That is the first stage of photosynthesis. Is another one of those biochemical processes that's very complicated and lots of stages to it. But that very first step of delivering that lump of light energy to the reaction center seems to be highly, highly efficient. And we can't understand why, because it's like a pinball sort of bouncing around randomly between through this forest of biomolecules. Chances are, if it's a sort of a classic random walk, it will just get lost. It will dissipate as waste heat, and yet it always finds its way to the center. And experiments carried out some years ago in the US showed that, in fact, what looked like was happening was that this photon was pursuing multiple routes simultaneously. You know, if you've read any popular science on quantum mechanics, you'll be aware of what's called the two-slit experiment, where you send particles individually, one at a time, through a screen with two slits, and you get an interference pattern building up on the other side, as though each individual particle somehow went through both slits at the same time. There's a whole other lecture that I could talk to you about. It's pretty amazing stuff, but absolutely established. Well, it looks like the equivalent of that, it's not magic, it's how the quantum world behaves. The equivalent of that is this photon pursuing all possible routes through the cell in photosynthesis. Magnetoreception in birds, I will say a little bit about that in a moment. That is, although still speculative, a very exciting idea that quantum entanglement plays a role in the way certain animals are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field. Olfaction is another. Again, this is speculative, and again, many people working in the field refute it. The idea is the way we smell, the scent receptors in our nose capture the scent molecule as it comes in, and it's what's called the lock and key mechanism. The molecule has to have the right shape to fit in a particular receptor, and that receptor then sends a signal to the brain telling us that you've smelled oranges or rotten eggs or whatever. But there's been a problem with this lock and key explanation. It can't be the whole story, because there are molecules with very different shapes that have the same smell. And it's been suggested that that's down to the vibrations of the bonds within these scent molecules. If they have the right vibrational frequency, then that's what triggers the same scent. And one explanation as to how that might work is through quantum mechanics. When the scent is captured in the receptor, that triggers an electron tunneling across from one point in the molecule to another, triggering the signal. So again, quantum mechanics may play a role in our sense of smell. An area that I'm interested in working in, where I've published work over the last few years, is very interesting, and certainly I would imagine of interest to you, whether quantum tunneling plays a role in mutations, base mutations in DNA. We know that mutations take place for all sorts of reasons, whether it's copying errors, whether it's ionizing radiation. It's just, without mutations, there would be no evolution, right? Nothing would change. Maybe one of the ways that a mutation takes place is the hydrogen bonds that hold the DNA together, the hydrogen bond, the proton may jump from one place to another. I'll say something about that in a moment. There are more speculative areas, connections with cancer, connections with the origin of life, connections with the nature of consciousness. These are very speculative ideas, and I sort of leave them aside because that's the sort of area that will make Daily Mail headlines. Quantum physics cures cancer. Quantum physics will probably cause cancer the following week. So these are areas where not really at the moment part of serious study, certainly not the way you'd get research funding in universities. But we are starting to get funders looking carefully and funding research in the other areas. For example, at Surrey, the Leverhulme Trust has just funded a £1 million doctoral training centre where we're taking on PhD students working in lots of areas in quantum biology now. So that's very, very exciting. And it's the first in the world, in fact. So we're starting to see some sort of respectability being gained by this new field. So what is it that quantum mechanics requires? I've mentioned it's not the basic quantized energy levels of electrons going around atoms. It's what's called non-trivial quantum phenomena. Quantum coherence, long-lived quantum. So the idea, for example, in photosynthesis, where a photon can go in multiple paths simultaneously, that's what's called quantum superposition or quantum coherence. And when we try and study that effect in the lab, in a physics lab, we have to be very careful. We have to do our experiments, conduct them in a vacuum. We have to do them near absolute zero. We have to shield our apparatus from the external environment. This is what people studying and trying to develop quantum computers are trying to do. It's really hard. And the reason for that is because a quantum system is never completely isolated. It's always interacting with its surroundings. It's always leaking out its quantum coherence in a process called decoherence. And the idea that quantum coherence could survive inside the messy, noisy, warm environment of a living cell is a huge surprise and a huge mystery. And so that is one of the big surprises and the reasons why is one of the things we're trying to understand. How, if it does take place, how is it lasting long enough to have some biological effect? Superposition, likewise, particles being in two places at once or spinning in two directions at once. Quantum tunneling, and of course quantum entanglement. Two particles that are separated. If this one is spinning up and down at the same time, and this one's spinning up and down at the same time, when you measure this one, you see it spinning up, you instantaneously cause that one to spin down. It's not that it was spinning down all the time. It only makes its choice after we've measured this one, even if they're on either side of the universe. Very, very counterintuitive ideas, and yet we know quantum entanglement does take place. Physicists and chemists are familiar with it. Our research at Surrey, how am I doing for time? I want to only talk for a few more minutes. Research at Surrey looking at quantum tunneling in DNA. If you zoom in on the two strands of DNA and look at two of the one base pair, A and T, they are bonded together. So these are the ladders in the twisted double helix of DNA. Those are hydrogen bonds. And so I said, biologists use balls and stick models, and we should move beyond that. This was generated by a computer code, an ex-PhD student of mine did, Adam Godbeer, and he assured me at the time that took about 2 or 3 months just to produce that diagram, because he was using a mathematical model called density functional theory, where you're basically putting in the positions and sort of energies of all the atoms in these two large molecules and seeing how they dynamically change over time. Well, the idea is that these white balls here, these are hydrogen atoms, or protons. I'm a nuclear physicist, so who cares about electrons? It's just a proton. They connect up. So the blue is nitrogen, the red is oxygen. So this proton's hydrogen bond connects up to nitrogen atoms. So this is A and T, the two nucleotides. And it's a double pair. So you've got another proton connecting oxygen with nitrogen. It's been known for half a century that there's the possibility that those protons, they're sitting in their most stable position, closer to one side than the other. They're not in the middle. But they could jump across to the other side. So see that, and if one jumps, the other jumps, we believe. And it's been known for a while that could happen. And the question is, what if they don't have enough energy to jump across? Can they quantum tunnel across? And that's something that we're still looking into, trying to understand. Because if they do jump across and they find themselves in what's called the tautomeric form, the wrong position, and then the strands of DNA split in the process of replication, well, when they come to make copies of themselves, because that single proton's in the wrong place, you won't get A binding to T again. Okay? So you end up with a mutation. So what's the chances that you end up with a mutation due to quantum tunneling? And if it's, it may be near zero. It may be lost in the noise compared with all the other ways that a mutation can take place. But if it is important, we need to know. And we don't know what the implications might be if we're able to control this tunneling process in DNA and control mutations. So that's a very speculative question that we still have yet to answer. I've mentioned photosynthesis, so I won't go through that again. The idea that the photon that is captured, the sunlight is delivered through quantum superposition, following multiple routes simultaneously. I just want to give the last example, which is I've mentioned that cover of Nature magazine with the bird. Well, that's because of the famous European robin. Distinct from the British robin, which is sedentary, it spends all its life here in British Isles. The European robin that lives up in northern Scandinavia and Siberia, far too cold for it to survive the winter up there, so it migrates down to the Mediterranean every autumn. And it was discovered by this pair of ornithologists, the Vilchkos, that one of the ways that the robin is able to gain navigational sense of direction is by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. Hugely controversial when they published their papers in Nature and Science back in the 1970s, but we now know it's established. Certain animals, and it's not just the robin, there's all sorts of animals and insects that now we believe are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field. It's almost ridiculous. I mean, those of you who work with with MRI scanners, and I don't know how many Tesla the magnetic field is, and think about the tiny, tiny magnetic field strength of the Earth's field, and how could that possibly affect chemistry? Well, it does seem to be able to do that, but then there therefore needs to be a very sensitive chemical compass somewhere in these, within these animals. And no one knows where it is, but there is one theory that is there's no smoking gun to prove that that's the correct explanation, but there is one theory that fits everything, and it's based on quantum mechanics. We know, for example, that this magnetoreception in these animals is light sensitive. It's triggered by light. So we think the compass is somewhere residing in the animal's retina. The European robin, for example, it flies and a photon enters its eye and it hits a light receptive molecule. We think the best candidate molecule for that is something called cryptochrome. And so it's not the rods and cones inside the eye. The cryptochrome is a different protein that is also light sensitive. And when that photon hits cryptochrome, it knocks an electron from an atom which was with a pair with its partner within that atom. And that electron is knocked across to another part of the molecule. But those two electrons remain quantum entangled. So the way they spin, one spinning one way, the other spinning the other way, for example, is very sensitive. The way they dance is very sensitive to an external magnetic field, like the Earth's field. And that would give signals to the bird's eye. So it's almost like augmented reality, sort of superimposed on its field of vision would be a spot that tells it which direction to go, following the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. The thing is, not only is the theory hard to try and model this, but it's even harder to try and carry out the experiments to confirm this. The experiments to convince us that the birds are sensitive to the magnetic field, they've been done, they're established. These people, the ornithologists will capture the robin in nets in mid-migration, take them back to their labs and put them inside these cones with ink pads at the bottom, so the birds get their feet all messy, and you have blotting paper around the side of this funnel, and then you trap the bird in there. And of course, the bird is trying to escape, but it always wants to fly in the direction of its migration, to continue its journey. And so they see its footprints preferentially in one direction when they go and check it the next day. But if they stick this apparatus inside magnetic coils, Helmholtz coils, these are sort of magnetic coils that can replicate the Earth's magnetic field. So if you have them with the opposite polarity to the Earth's magnetic field, you can cancel out the magnetic field. So the bird loses any sense of direction. And sure enough, you see the footprints all over, all around the funnel. So that's established. But what is that compass? Is it quantum mechanics at play? We still don't know. Okay, so to summarize, we are still, this is still a new area of science. It's still speculative. It may be that a lot of these effects can be explained in other ways. It may be that because they don't play a functional role in biology, most biologists will just come up with the so what question. Okay, so, okay, fine, go and have fun with your quantum mechanics, and down at some level, quantum mechanics is at play. It doesn't affect how we learn about the workings of the living cell. But it may be that it does play a crucial role, and we do need to understand it. And we don't know where else some of these effects might appear. But certain mechanisms inside living cells do seem to require a helping hand from quantum mechanics. We don't know how it's possible. I mentioned that inside living cells, decoherence should take place very, very quickly. It's a warm, messy, complex environment. And one of the research areas now, I have, in fact, 3 PhD students working on different aspects of this problem. How does the environment affect the quantum system? Has life evolved a way of staving off decoherence, of maintaining these quantum effects for biological timescales to make use of them. It's not magic. You know, if life has had 3.5 billion years to come up with any trick it can find, if quantum mechanics will help make a certain process more efficient, life will have found it and will make use of it. So it's not magic. But how are we able to do, the quantum mechanics, how is it able to survive inside living cells? Has life evolved the way of the bonds within these molecules vibrating at certain frequency that are resonating with these quantum processes that keep them alive rather than destroy them? Has nature hit upon a shortcut, basically? And of course, can we learn from some of these approaches that maybe life has developed to develop our own biosensors, imaging techniques? Already people are starting to look at, there's a paper recently from a group in Stanford who are looking at developing living sensors down at the nanoscale that possibly could actually utilize the rules of quantum mechanics to give us far more precise imaging and diagnostic techniques. So it's a young field. We have to wait to see whether it revolutionizes the world or goes away. But I think it's too big a question to ignore. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.